Welcome to Camp Constitution Radio with your host, Hal Shurlteff. This show is heard on WBCQ The Planet every Monday night at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. It broadcasts out of the beautiful town of Monticello, Maine in Aroostook County. And it's also heard on IPMNation.org, which is a online 24-hour news source. It's heard Saturday afternoons at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And also on YouTube, and I think you can go to TuneIn, which is an online way to access not just this show, but WBCQ and all the great programming. Or just go to WBCQ.com, I believe, and you can get the station and get all the great programs on this wonderful radio station. I'm expecting to have a guest, Mr. John McManus, calling in any minute now. But before we do, I just want to talk a little bit about the entity that sponsors this show. It's sponsored by Camp Constitution, which, among other things, runs a week-long family camp. And we just had our successful camp just a few weeks ago. And next year's camp will be held in the Berkshires of Massachusetts, Western Massachusetts, August 5th to the 11th. And we're lining up another exciting program week. And we do have some tentative plans to have a winter camp in New Jersey. We haven't signed a contract yet, but we're looking into that. And looking to expand the camp program as well, maybe add another summer camp next to next year's portfolio, so to speak. We also have a speakers bureau where we have folks from different specialties and different topics, from the Constitution to morality to Agenda 21, Article 5, and so forth. And these folks are just ready to speak to your group anywhere in the United States and even in other parts of the world, depending on availability and time. And we'd love to make that possible. So if you visit our website and click on Speakers Bureau, you'll find our portfolio of speakers. And speaking of which, I'm scheduled to be up in Maine later on in late August 26th, 20 Thursday. I'm going to be speaking Thursday, August 24th, in Waldoboro, Maine. That would be, let me just double check the calendar here. Yes, Thursday, August 24th in Waldoboro, Maine at noontime. And all of these presentations will concern Agenda 21 to Agenda 2030. That's the new term, and an expose and what people can do. So Waldoboro at 181 Jefferson Street in Waldoboro, Maine. That's Central Coastal Maine. That's 12 o'clock noontime. And there'll be a light lunch served. And then at 7 o'clock that same night in Lincoln, Maine at the Veterans American Legion Post, I'll be speaking on the same topic. And then Friday, I'll be up in Holton, Maine at 6 o'clock. Tang's Chinese Cuisine right on Route 1. That will be at 6 o'clock. And then the following day, I will be at the Northeastland Hotel at 9 o'clock. And that's right in Presque Isle, Maine, right on Route 1. It's the only hotel right in town. And anyway, so if you're interested in attending one of these events, just contact us, give us a call, visit our website where you can ask a question or give us your contact information. Also, visit us on Facebook. We have all of the events that we have scheduled, not just the main events, but we're going to be doing a information table at the Cheshire Fair coming up just in a few days. That's in Cheshire County, New Hampshire, just south of Keene is where that place. We'll be there for 3 days. Actually, 4 days, with an information table and take our famous 10-question quiz. And we have other events going on. We show up at numerous events in the region and with information tables and homeschool shows and tea party rallies, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, well, this was an interesting week, I should say last week. There was an issue that got a lot of people on the left really, really upset. It's Donald Trump and the fact that he changed he reversed Obama's transgenders in the military. Now, many of you listening to this show were in the military, different parts of the world, but mainly in the United States. I'm hoping that most of our listeners are English-speaking in the United States. Anyway, I was in the 70s. I took an oath of office, 1976, oath to defend the Constitution. and I did active duty from 77 to 80, and then some reserve time after that, and made a staff sergeant. At that time, homosexuals were barred from the military, and if you did engage in homosexual activity, you were kicked out pretty quickly. When I was in Germany, there was a homosexual sex ring that was uncovered in our field artillery unit. It was a battery. Well, actually, it was it wasn't just our battery, but it was a number of people. There were 2 senior NCOs, a couple of enlisted men, and then obviously some Germans, nationals. The 2 senior NCOs were given the opportunity to either retire immediately with full benefits and get honorable discharge, or face court-martial, and so they retired pretty quickly. And the 2 enlisted men, as far as we know, they were just given, I don't even know what kind of discharges they gave, but they were gone within a day. Bingo, gone. Problem solved. The bottom line is that the military, it's not the U.S. Army, the U.S. Navy, Marines, or what have you, it's not a social program. You have to be effective. You have to be combat ready. Like it or not, that's what the military is for. It's not to deliver Avon products. It's to, if necessary, kill people, hopefully with as little amount of damage as possible. But that's what it was set up to do. And diplomacy fails. That's what the military is for. And yeah, they do humanitarian things. That's true, but that's not their main mission. And in order to have combat readiness, that means you have to have a good morale. You cannot have people engaging in homosexual activities. There are some units that were, at the time I spent about a year in the 101st Airborne, and it was an upper echelon entity, and there were ladies in the unit, but they did not stay in the same barracks as the men. Well, actually, they stayed in the same barracks, but on the same floor. And if you actually had a female in your room, you were given an Article 15, at least the first time, and that was a steep fine, and sometimes they sent a reduction in rank. So if you're an E4, you become an E3 and lose about a month's pay. You do it again, you're going to face serious charges. And the same thing with ladies. If a lady brought a man into her room, the same thing happened. So it was a good reason for that. You could date late. If you're in the same rank, you could date and do what you want off post. That was your business. But it wasn't really encouraged because, again, when you're even in fifth echelon or rear echelon type things, there's always potential to be a front line. I mean, you're going to be bombed. Who knows at what point the enemy can break through, and next thing you know, you're at the front line. And morale issues and so forth are very important here. So that was the Army I was in. And it's changed a little bit when Bill Clinton had "Don't Ask, Don't Tell." It means, yeah, it's still illegal. It's still against policy to engage in homosexual activity, but we're not going to ask you, and you don't tell. You don't tell us, we won't tell you, and that's fine. But if there was, you got a room, let's say you're in a barracks, and you're in close quarters, in some cases for very long periods of time. And what if there was a woman in barracks of 20 men? Well, that's an issue. And maybe one of the males is having a relationship with that woman, and you're in the bunk next door. I mean, that's something that's not correct there. Well, now it's okay to be a male and be in that unit and engage in that activity. It's really like having a woman in the barracks. It's really what it is, because these men, they prefer the sexual practices of men. So, and it's been accepted. Now, yes, over the years, historically, there's been homosexuals. Usually it's not a good thing. It's always been a negative aspect of that. And we're a little different. We are the United States Army, or the United States military. Don't tell me, well, the Israelis do this, so this unit does this, so this country does that. I don't care what these other countries do. I don't care if they have all female lesbian units, as far as I'm concerned. In fact, this is what's really fascinating about this issue is that the people on the far left, they hate the military. If there's a new weapon system that would be used to keep more Americans alive, they don't want it. They don't want to see updated weaponry. They don't want to see updated aircraft carriers. They'll vote no if they're members of Congress. But when it comes to homosexuality, they love the military. Yes, we should all serve. Why can't I serve? I'm a patriotic. I'm competent and I'm capable. I can lift 300 pounds and I can do all these kinds of. I'm a great shot. I can shoot better than any of my heterosexual counterparts, et cetera, et cetera. All of a sudden, you're a great patriot. You know, it's like women in the military, too, in combat roles especially. All of the leftists, the feminists that despise the military, all of a sudden want women to serve in the military. That to me is another issue. It's a biblical issue, too, not just one that makes bad policy. But look, you look at the Old Testament, and they talked about who should serve. And I think it was in, was it not Judges? Anyway, I'm trying to think of what book of the Bible. In the first 5 books talks about that married men don't serve. If you're faint-hearted, you shouldn't serve. And that's an interesting point, too. A lot of people remember the famous face-slapping incident, General Patton, in World War II. I think there was 1 or 2 times there was a soldier in Sicily that was shell-shocked, and he, I don't know if he actually ran from the combat or what have you, but he's sort of in the hospital, the Army hospital tent there, sniveling and crying, and Patton slaps him around and tells him to get his rear end on the front line. Well, General Patton was a whole lot better military guy than I ever will be, but I think that was not a right thing for him to do, because you don't want somebody on that front line that will run away. You need to be able to rely on those people in your unit. And if someone is faint-hearted, or in this case a coward, you're better off having him out of harm's way, because he's going to get you killed as well. So, so the idea that putting women in harm's way when it's not necessary, to me, is repugnant, and it just shows you how far along the line, how we've declined morally. I remember this picture of a husband kissing his wife goodbye, holding the babies as she goes off to Afghanistan or Iraq. And then there was this father so proud of his daughter, she ended up losing a leg. And he's supposed to be a Christian, and he thought, and she was put in harm's way. He should have been ashamed of himself. He should not have allowed, if he could, say, no, yeah, you have something. There are places for women in the military, no question about it, but not combat. And there are some heroic women out there. There are some women that can shoot well, great shots, no doubt can probably take a few guys down. But overall, that's not the case. Women don't have the upper body strength, 50% less than men, and women aren't supposed to be killers. It's bad enough that men have to do that, but put a woman in that position. That's not that's not what the military should be about. And it's really sad that our culture has tolerated this. And of course, the number of rapes have gone up. I just read an article recently about homosexual raping has skyrocketed in the military. Well, no kidding. When you're allowing them in, and it's not just allowing them in. It's also they start promoting the homosexuals, the various policies that they have. So they're openly, not only are they tolerating it, but they're promoting the lifestyle in the military. If you question it, you'll be a subject for court-martial. Just what happens when they had so-called same-sex marriage in Massachusetts. They changed laws, they changed employment laws, contract laws, even how the birth certificates are done. I mean, it's not just live and let live. Who cares if they want to get married? What's the big deal? Well, it is a big deal to them. It's a very big deal to them. And that's something that we should not be tolerating. And I'm glad to see that Trump, and to me, it's a no-brainer when it comes to transgender. First off, most of them are men becoming women. And I say become, they're not really becoming women. They're getting their bodies mutilated. They call it gender reassignment surgery. And it costs lots of money, depending on how much it's done, from shaving the Adam's apple to doing some other things to the penis. And then it's the drugs they have to take on a regular basis, every day or once a week or whatever it is, expensive drugs to maintain that feminine side, So that's totally unnatural. And these people have a very high percentage a very high suicide rate. So why would you want people in your ranks that have a high suicide rate, that require all kinds of drugs to maintain their sex change, et cetera, really maintain the illusion of their sex change, at the cost of the taxpayers, at the cost of unit effectiveness, at the cost of morale? I mean, to me, it's a no-brainer. But again, the people who support this could care less about the military. They hate the military. And again, it's an issue that you would think in a sane culture that we wouldn't be tolerating. We wouldn't be thinking about it. but it becomes a story. I'm hoping that ultimately Congress is the entity that makes the laws and rules concerning the military. Article 1, Section 8. So back, I think it was 2008, 2007, they changed the law or the rules and allowed homosexuals to serve in the military. Prior to that was don't ask, don't tell. And lots of good people left. That's what happens. Gresham's law isn't just in economics, too, folks. It's in other things, too. Bad in Gresham's law, bad money chases good out. The same thing. Bad policy will chase good people out of any unit, whether it be a military, be a company. You get a company run by incompetent people, the good people will leave and find someplace else to go. So you're losing a lot of good soldiers and have because they obviously have no faith and trust in the folks that are running the show. So I was going to speak to John McManus. I guess he must have forgot to call in. He is the only instructor, I believe, that has not been on this show, instructor at our camp. And we were going to talk about the United Nations. And since he didn't call in, I'll have to wing it myself. It's not that I haven't spoken on the subject. The United Nations, when the average American hears that, well, it used to be, you hear the term United Nations, and many people had a very positive response to the United Nations. Oh, well, it's a place where people can talk. It's better to talk than it is to fight. And, there's some problems there. We all don't agree. But overall, it's a good organization. They're doing great work, all kinds of humanitarian efforts all over the world on a regular basis, and so forth. And then there are some people who will say, oh, the UN is just useless. It's a waste of time, that it's not set up what it was supposed to do, and so forth. So, but we really shouldn't get out of it. And I heard I had given a presentation on the subject, and I thought I made a really good case why we should get out. And he came up to me and he said, and he was a conservative Tea Party type guy too. He said, well, we got to keep our friends close, but our enemies closer. I said, you know what? I said, we don't need to take the advice from some script writer in a Hollywood movie. I said, no, you don't want your enemies closer. You want to put your enemies, put them out of harm's way. I don't want my enemies close to me. I don't want to have any enemies, and if I do, I want to dispatch them as quickly as possible, not keep them close by me so they can stick a knife into me. So a little history in the UN. The UN was founded in even during World War II. They had a couple of early meetings. They had one in Dunbarton Oaks, which is a area of Washington, D.C., a suburb. And that was I think it was in 44. And then in 45, they had a conference in San Francisco. And the war was over. Let's see, it was in Germany, the war ended in May. And in Japan, it was September. So I believe it was right around the end of the Japanese surrender, right around that time. They convened in San Francisco. A man named Alger Hiss was the acting general secretary, and he and a Soviet national whose name I can't remember on the top of my head, they wrote the UN Charter. Now, Alger Hiss, a few years later, was discovered to be a Soviet agent. I would prefer to say a Stalinist agent as opposed to a Soviet agent, because he was working for Stalin. And here was a man from an upper middle class to wealthy background. He was a graduate of Columbia University. He had the world at his fingertips, and he was a communist. He was a traitor. And he was the man that wrote the UN Charter. So my question is, what good can come from the pen or the mind of a man, a U.S.-born citizen, that would actively work with Stalin, a Stalinist agent, to betray this great country? What good can come from the pen? Well, take a look at that charter, and it's really a war document. It's a war charter. It's not a peace charter. So they define peace, and the average person hears the term peace, and we think, well, peace is where there's an end to hostilities, and there's a general, people are working together, and they're safe, and they're secure, et cetera, et cetera. That's not how a communist or a socialist defines peace. Peace means the destruction of their enemies. That's what they mean by peace. And if you read the UN Charter, it also talks about, they use the term enshrine. Isn't it fascinating? People who reject the scriptures, who reject Christianity, the Bible, they reject the Bible, but they don't reject the UN Charter because the values that are enshrined in the UN Charter. They seem to look at the UN as gospel, and they do. They're humanists, and there are a lot of Christians who are humanists too, and they rejected the truth of Christianity and they embraced humanism, the worship of man. I'm digressing a little bit here, but anyway, so the UN, it was sold to a war-weary world. Let's say that quick 3 times. It's kind of difficult. As mankind's last and best hope for peace. And World War II was devastating. Millions of people were killed. Millions were injured. Lives were disrupted, and billions of dollars were spent. To put. Hopefully, the war would come to a good conclusion. Unfortunately, it didn't, and the UN played a role in that as well. Stalin got Eastern Europe, Yalta. He got a good chunk of course, the Chinese communists were put in power thanks to the policies that happened after World War II. But the American people said, we've had 2 world wars in a very short frame of time. Let's just try something. So it was a treaty. The UN was established by a treaty. And when it comes to treaties, you look at the Constitution, treaties usually deal with things that between separate nations. Well, the United Nations isn't an entity. It's really a collection of third world misfits and communists and socialists even to this day. It is not a sovereign country. You can make treaties with sovereign countries, and that's what we do all the time. But so we basically, the UN is almost like a super government, and you made a treaty with a super government. And so the only 2 senators voted against it. I think there was a third that was absent, and he would have. I can't remember. He was from Tennessee, but Shipstead and Langer, 2 not necessarily 2 very well-known senators, they took the time to read the treaty. There were some, like Robert Taft, Senator Taft, that regretted voting for it within a few years. He said something like, "Let's do it alone. It's a trap. Let's do it alone." And there were some constitutional scholars that from the very beginning of it said, we don't want to be part of this, just like they rejected the League of Nations. But the League of Nations, I think it was chapter or Article 10 or Chapter 10 that said that the militaries of the world would be used. An invasion, when one nation of the League of Nations is attacked, it's an attack on all the nations, which means that, for example, the United States, if Italy's attacked by Greece, we have to go to fight Greece. And that was a violation of our Constitution, so that's why that was rejected. But in World War, and after the UN, when the UN was founded, they set up a Security Council. And I think there's 5 permanent members, and then they have rotating members. And when the Security Council votes, we're talking about 9 or 10 people, to send troops somewhere, or people that represent 10 nations or so, anywhere in the world, we have to send soldiers. And in 1945, after the UN treaty was signed, or passed, I should say, the Congress, the House and Senate, passed the UN Participation Act. And that basically, and it was totally unconstitutional, but it said that when the UN Security Council wants soldiers sent somewhere, we will comply. And that's why we sent soldiers to Korea. In fact, we were like 95% of the fighting force fighting against the Chinese and North Koreans. I'm sure they were and the Russians there as advisors and so forth. Vietnam, that was fought under a subdivision of the UN called the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, CETO, which is now defunct. NATO was set up, and again, I was part of NATO, not realizing at the time what NATO was. NATO is really a UN subdivision. If you look at its organic, its chapter or charter, it basically says they do everything in pursuance of the UN. And when you, there's a document too that's a classic Orwellian document. It's the UN Covenant on Civil and Political International Affairs. And the UN Charter, that was passed, or the UN Covenant, that was passed, I think it was 1948. And it said, boy, it gave you all these wonderful rights. And then it said that basically all those rights can be taken away at the whim of government. And that's in the UN Charter, too. Under the UN Charter, you have the right to a vacation, the right to travel, the right to have your own job, all these wonderful rights. And then you look down and I forget from chapter 1 to I think it's in chapter 8, that all of these things are subject to law. So they can pass a law against it, and guess what? All those rights they just granted to you are taken away. It's Orwellian doublespeak. And historically, the UN has always been pro-communist. It has supported communist nations, nations that support terrorism, and almost always our interests are voted against. And there are some cases where our own delegates vote against our own interests. And that's another thing, too. The UN is always talking about democracy, democracy, democracy. Well, when was the last time you voted for a delegate to the UN? Not much democracy going on there, folks. It is treachery, and it's costing us billions of dollars each year, and American lives are being sent in these endless wars. In Afghanistan, Gulf War. This is something. Go to YouTube and put in George Bush New World Order speech. This is Daddy Bush, George H.W. Bush. He gave this speech in 1990 in the wake of his announcement from Desert Shield to Desert Storm. And he said, we finally have a chance at this New World Order. And then he defined what it was. He said, a UN as envisioned by its founders. Now, he was a Ivy League graduate, Yale University. He headed the CIA. He served a term in Congress. He was vice president for 2 terms and then became president for 1 term. Pretty smart guy. Could fly a plane. The guy was pretty sharp. Well, he should have known. All he had to do was read Ed Griffin's book, The Fearful Master. He could have got a copy of that. I'm sure someone sent him to one. He would have found out. He should have known that the UN was founded by mainly communists, American communists, not just Alger Hiss, Noel Field, and Victor Perlo, and a number of others. These guys weren't just liberal, progressive, free thinkers. They were out-and-out communists. I'll never forget, I got a letter. A gentleman from a town a few towns away from me. I'm in Boston. He lived in the town of Norwood. I had a letter about NAFTA, why we should repeal NAFTA. And he wrote to me, and he thanked me for the letter. His last name was Field. I think it was Noah Field. And he mentioned that his uncle was a State Department Red, and I still have the letter somewhere. And he was part of that. His uncle actually had a fleet to Eastern Europe. He was one of the delegates at the founding meeting in San Francisco. So, yes. So they were out-and-out communists that were part of the founding of the UN. And George Bush simply affirmed that he wanted to have something that they envisioned, which would have been which is what I did want, a world government or a new world order. Anyway, boy, there's so much to talk about the UN, and I only got a minute left. But we do have some. If you visit our YouTube channel, just put down "Get Us Out of the UN," "Get Us Out of Agenda 21." You will get some great documents, some good things on that, and why we need to get out of the UN. There's a bill in Congress right now to get us out of the UN. There's been a bill for a number of years, and please take some action if you live in the United States to get us out of the UN, and contact us for more information and some great resources. There's a book called The Fearful Master. You can visit us on Amazon. Go to our website and click on our link to Amazon, and you can see The Fearful Master by Ed Griffin, Changing Commands by John McManus, who was supposed to be calling in. And we also have Global Gun Grab by the late Will Grigg, which is an excellent book also. And there's just a lot of resources out there. So get informed, and then get a hold of your congressman, your senator and your member of Congress, your 2 senators, and say, please support the bill to get us out of the UN. With that, we want to thank you for listening. God bless, and until next week, have a great week, and God bless again.